familiar with. Since 2015, we have been promoting the spread of Barnahus model throughout Europe. And before I welcome today's speaker, I will just very shortly say what a Barnahus is and why we're here, and set the stage for today's webinar. In case you are new to us, the Barnahus, sometimes known as a children's house, is not a place where children go to stay. Rather, it's a child-friendly office where children go to tell about their abuse to many different people in a coordinated way. And they do this in an environment that's designed just for them, and in a process designed to prevent traumatization and re-traumatization. This process feeds into criminal and welfare procedures. So what this means is that law enforcement, criminal justice, child protection services, medical professionals, and mental health professionals are cooperating under one roof to provide rapid access to justice and care for child victims and witnesses of violence. We're now in the second phase of Promise. The first phase launched a European level dialogue, which explored the criteria for Barnahus in depth and developed standard-setting publications. In the second phase, right now, we're supporting many countries to develop their own national dialogues, agreements, capacity, and more. And these webinars invite all interested professionals, wherever they are, to take part in the European Barnahus movement. This is a movement that is brought together by a burning desire to learn about the key principles and standards and challenges to consider when opening and operating a multidisciplinary interagency collaboration for child victims and witnesses of violence in your own country. We're so glad that you could join us today. If you haven't heard about our exciting follow-up plans for the Promise Network and for the follow-up project, be sure to check out our website. And if you have any questions about the Barnahus model more generally, please don't hesitate to ask in the chat. We have knowledgeable colleagues on the call today who can answer your questions and share their experiences with you. And of course, we especially encourage questions about the topic of today's webinar, therapeutic services at the Barnahus. Before handing over to Paola, you should know just a few things. A key common criteria of Barnahus is that psychological support, including short-term and long-term therapeutic services for trauma, should be available to the child and to non-offending family members and caretakers. According to Barnahus Quality Standard number 8, there are 4 essential aspects to providing such services at a Barnahus. Assessment and treatment is routine. Staff have specialized training. Information and support for arranging treatments is provided to children and their caregivers. And crisis support interventions are provided when needed. Research and experience shows that effective treatments can minimize negative social, emotional, and developmental effects of trauma on the child, and such treatments should be offered as soon as possible. In the Promise Barnahus quality standards, you can read much more about this, including some assessment and treatment protocols, and even read about some concrete examples of how therapeutic services in Iceland, Croatia, and Ninchupang are provided. The standards come in a long version, an ebook, and also some short version, one short version that's in many languages. Check out all the other publications at the link. Now it's time to welcome Paola. You can turn on your camera now. And while you do that, I will just say that we are so glad that you could take some time to deliver this webinar today. At Barnahus Izland, we specialize in forensic interviewing and trauma-focused therapies, and we are eager to hear about the different types of therapy and tools that you use in your work, especially about trauma-focused CBT. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here and going through or explaining to you the way we work at Barnahus. I'm gonna give you an explanation of what I do. Maybe first, my name is Paola Cardenas, and I'm psychologist and clinical psychologist and family therapist, and also a forensic interviewer. And I have been working at Barnahus for 6 years already, but my experience as a psychologist is of I think 12 to 13 years. It's a long time. So the topics that I will cover today is it's first of all, why it's important to assess children's symptoms. And I will also give you a review of different trauma-focused therapies that we work with at Barnahus, especially trauma-focused CBT. And I'm also, throughout the presentation, gonna give you some hints of how to work with small children, because it can be a little bit different, but still is the same therapy. So first of all, the importance of assessment. I will sometimes go fast through the through the PowerPoints slides, but you will have the slides later on to just read. I'm gonna send a question now just to know how many people are experienced in working with the children using trauma-focused therapy. So first of all, in Barnahus Iceland, victim therapy can start soon after the forensic interview. For children who disclose abuse, we always suggest treatment. Children are assigned to a therapist, which is not the same therapist as, is different from the interviewer, so the same therapist that did the forensic interview. And this therapist provides treatment and follow-up. We in Iceland, we have one Barnahus and one satellite, so we travel around the country to provide treatment to children. So maybe like I go to the north of Iceland, I have 6-7 children that I meet there. For instance, I also go to the south, I also have a few children there. So we fly or drive, since we don't have other Barnahuses around the country. Also, all of us therapists, psychotherapists, are trained in evidence-based treatment approaches. And we are in very close collaboration with child protection services. We also provide expertise to police and the legal system, and we are also witnesses in court proceedings. Assessment is always important. Obviously, it's good to know what you're going to work with. Otherwise you just have a child and you don't know anything about. So assessment is very important at the beginning of treatment. We at Barnahus Iceland, we use 3 to 4 therapy sessions in the beginning of treatment that are devoted to assessment and psychoeducation. And also during that time, we make sure that we are establishing a good therapeutic relationship, a good rapport with the child. So the assessment helps us to determine the symptoms and the history of the traumatic exposure, the strengths and weaknesses of the child and the parents, also the parenting skills and the support the child is being provided, and also the treatment and the need for treatment. Sometimes these 4 or 5 sessions are enough. Some children, they don't develop complex PTSD, or they just maybe develop a few symptoms, but after 4 or 5 sessions, they feel well. So also the first assessment helps us in creating the case formulation, just in order to understand the child and the family and see the effects of the trauma on the child and the family. And we also find out the developmental level of the child, because some children might have difficulty expressing themselves through language. They might have easier time doing it through drawing or through play. So this is a good way to also determine the level of the child, the developmental level of the child. There's also sorry, I have to change. When working with small children, assessment is a bit different because we are not maybe asking the children to fill out some questionnaires. So we are in much more contact with the parents. We interview the parents or caregivers, and we also observe the parent-caregiver interaction. And we might, or in most cases, we ask the parents to fill out assessment tools, not the children. So then, with younger kids, we want to look at the reactions of the child and the parents to what happened. Also, if the parents have any resources in their environment to first of all to stabilize themselves and then their child. Also, we want to know how is their attachment, and if their parents are able to meet the emotional and physical needs, cognitive needs of the child. And we are in a very close collaboration with child protection services in those cases where we see that maybe parents are not reacting the way that is beneficial for the child. So child protections can, services can come in and maybe intervene in some way. Also, young children are more dependent on their parents' reaction. Young children don't necessarily develop complex PTSD, but if their parents have a very hard time with what happened to the child, it might affect the child. So if the parents are not coping well with what happened to the child, then it could affect the child. So if the parents cope better, then the kids go easier, have an easier time going through or like working with the therapist. So that's why it's important to work with the parents in those cases. We use formal with both smaller children and older children. We use formal standardized measures. So with the younger ones is their parents who fill out the questionnaires, and with children who are around 8 years and older, we use standardized measures. We might read the questions for the child, for a child that is younger than 11. We also use semi-structured interviews. We also use the clinical interviews. We interview with the therapist, with the parents and the children in order to figure out the symptoms of the child. We might do a timeline, also a history of trauma history of the child, and a genogram, the family map. And we also are very observant, especially during the first interviews, and also we observe the interaction between parents and children. Also, when the child is referred to Barnahus, the CPT, Child Protection Services, social worker, usually has done a very good pre-job at assessing, the situation, the family. So actually, the child protection social worker usually gives us a very good report. So we have a lot of information there as well. The assessment tools that we use at Barnahus are the one that we use the most is the UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles PTSD Index for DSM-4 and 5. The 4 is the older version. The 5th is the newest version. This has 2 reports, one for caregivers and one for children from 7 to 18. And with younger kids, we only ask the parents to fill out the caregiver report. We also use the PCL-5, and the PCL-5 is usually it's a list for adults, but it's very easy to use, and we have it translated in Icelandic, and we use it for older adolescents. And we also use the ADES-A, is a dissociation scale, and the A is for adolescents. And we use that in order to measure the degree of dissociation of the child. So we also have semi-structured interviews that we use in some cases, like the CAPS child and adolescent version. And then there's also the TESI, or the traumatic events screening inventory. But the ones that we use the most are the first 2, UCLA and the PCL, and the CAPS of those. We also find very important to measure also the symptoms of depression and anxiety. Because of course anxiety and depression are also symptoms of PTSD, but we want to know the degree. We want to know if the child is having suicidal thoughts or is feeling panicky at school and all that. When I talk about children, I'm talking about kids up to 18, according to the law. So the Beck's Youth Inventory 2nd edition is a very good list, and we use that a lot. It has 100 questions. It's easy to answer. and we read it for younger kids, like since from 8 years old, and then the older ones read it themselves. And then we use the CDI, or the COVAX Children Depression Inventory, which gives you different scales, like the symptoms of low energy, anhedonia, depression. So it's not only depression; it's just it divides in like different scales. Also, we use the DAS, Depression Anxiety Scale, Stress Scale. We use that with kids that are older than 15, and then the MASC, Multidimensional Anxiety Scale for children. We use that as well as the ADIS, which is Anxiety Disorders Interview Schedule for DSM-4. And that structure interview, the ADIS, has actually one section that asks about the symptoms of PTSD. So it's actually quite good. Also, some kids that develop PTSD, they also develop OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So then you have also a section there in the ADIS structure interview. You have a section there asking both kids and parents about the OCD symptoms. So that is actually a very good interview schedule, or structure interview. I'm now going to go through the different therapies that we use at Barnahus in Iceland. As I said before, all kids that are report abuse, they are offered therapy, and in the majority of cases, they come to therapy. The ones that don't want to come, they might quit after a few sessions, but actually I can say that in almost all the cases where children disclose abuse, they always start treatment. So it's based on individual needs, what the child needs. That's why assessment is so important. It's also age appropriate. We have to change the methods that we use when we're working with older children or with children that have disabilities. Another thing that is important to know is that we record all the forensic interviews, both the preliminary and the investigative interviews. So the recorded disclosure is used as part of the initial assessment and pre-treatment plan. So the therapist listens to the recording to get an idea of the child, the developmental level, and also what happened to the child. So the therapist knows exactly what happened to the child when the child begins treatment. And when we're working with the kids, in Barnahus, we're often encountering kids that are having symptoms of PTSD. Not all children meet diagnostic criteria. So not all children develop like post-traumatic stress disorder, but many of the kids have symptoms of post-traumatic stress. So kids with post-traumatic stress disorder often require full treatment of trauma-focused therapy. And children with light or few symptoms benefit from a lighter version of trauma-focused therapy, usually just the first level of the trauma therapy. For instance, in TF-CBT, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, the first part is psychoeducation and parental skills building, and this is sometimes enough for kids. Also in cases where because we also work with kids who have been physically abused at home, in those cases it could be a bit more complex. Trauma is maybe has been, the history of trauma has been for a longer time. Complex PTSD maybe develops. So we need a good collaboration with CPT and with maybe foster parents, and even with the parents, offending parents. Or so the therapy that we use, the therapies that we use the most in Barnahus Iceland are trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, with EMDR, and then CPT, which is a therapy used mostly with adults, but it's okay, to use it with kids that are very mature, adolescents that are, in their late teens, 17, 16. And also psychoeducation, sometimes is enough, family support therapy. We use play and sound therapy with younger kids, and then group therapy to build up self-esteem after treatment. According to the World Health Organization, TF-CBT and EMDR are therapies that are recommended when working with children. I added there 2 websites, or actually 3 websites, so that if you have interest in learning more about these therapies, you can go into these websites and you can go through online training. And also, you know, you can also maybe go into a course or like workshop. So, and then CPT is used, as I said, with older adolescents, but there's also an internet course online, you know, and the website is there. I'm going to skip this slide because I will talk a little bit more about that later, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive processing therapy is a short-term evidence-based treatment for PTSD. And it was developed to working with adults, but we have been using that with the older adolescents, and it works very well. CPT is a manualized therapy used by clinicians to help recover from PTSD and related conditions, and includes a lot of elements of cognitive behavioral therapy. It has a very specific protocol. You from the first page you open is like, welcome the patient. So it's a very easy to use actually. And it has all the homework, you know, you get a manual for therapists, and you get a workbook for the person in treatment. And it's up to 12 sessions, but you don't need to go through the 12 sessions. Some people recover quite quick, especially if it's just one trauma. The components of cognitive processing therapy are, first of all, psychoeducation. So it focuses on conceptual areas that related to trauma. So first you have to educate or psychoeducate about the PTSD symptoms and the different thoughts that might come, you know, distortions, cognitive distortions, and then the emotions that are normal to feel when you have gone through trauma. Then you go through the part of processing the trauma, and then in that part there's this identifying of maladaptive beliefs, stock points they're called in CPT. So for instance, thoughts like, it's my fault that this happened to me because I went back to this house, or it's my fault that this happened to me because I didn't scream or try to run away. So you work with these stock points. And in that way, you learn, you are helping the patient to challenge these thoughts that keep the mind stuck. And then there's trauma themes or themes that you work with. You know, the trauma causes damage to safety, trust, control, esteem, and intimacy. So these are things that you talk about. And then talk about, you know, the next step of enhancing the quality of life, you know, facing the future and having a better quality of life. So this therapy is actually very good to work with kids that are, you know, very, you know, mature, because it's a lot of exercises and homework, and some kids don't like that. So I don't use it very much. Because I think that most children don't like to have, you know, both homework at school and at therapy. So, but I use some of the elements of this therapy. There's good exercises that are very nice to use. So then you have the EMDR. EMDR is an evidence-based treatment for kids, for adults who have experienced trauma-related difficulties. It focuses on reprocessing the trauma memories, and it has also a standardized protocol, but you know, something that you really need to train for. It's a bit, it's not complicated, but it's, you need to experience it yourself to understand it. It usually works quite quick, but for more complex trauma, you might need more sessions. The components of EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing, are the, first of all, as with other therapies, is the history taking and the treatment planning or the formulation, case formulation. Then in preparation, you have to explain, how the process works. Assessment is also very important. And then it begins the desensitization, so the memory becomes less strong. And then you try to install better ways to cope with things in life and with difficult things that might present in life. You do body awareness, body scanning, and then you finish the session. So this is in one session. You do assessment, desensitization, installation, body scan, closure, and then the next session you do re-evaluation and then assessment, and So I'm going to show you a small, very short video of this. Okay, so that's next.
If you have experienced something horrible and have developed psychological symptoms such as flashbacks, fears, sadness or sleep problems, you may well be helped by EMDR, a proven and effective therapy. Suppose you have been confronted with a violent crime, an accident, you have been bitten by a dog, or you have had to deal with sexual abuse or violence at home. Such a powerful experience is stored into your brain with a lot of emotions. Once such a memory is stored in your long-term memory, it can bother you for quite a long time. The disturbing memory keeps coming back unintentionally, for example with feelings of powerlessness or believing you are not worthwhile. EMDR therapy can help you get rid of these complaints and feelings. At first, an EMDR therapist will ask you to activate the memory of this disturbing experience from your long-term memory. The memory is now stored in your short-term memory, also called the working memory. Then the EMDR therapist will ask you to focus on this horrible event. From there, the therapist will move his fingers in front of your eyes rapidly back and forth and ask you to track his fingers as best and as fast as you can. By keeping a traumatic memory in your mind and tracking the fingers of the therapist at the same time, the working memory gets to process a lot of information at the same time. As it is so much information, the image becomes blurred and loses its emotional charge. When the emotional charge of an image lessens, it also becomes easier to think differently about the experience. You will notice this because you feel less powerless or you feel worthwhile again. The intrusions have gone and you feel less anxious. You feel less depressed, you sleep better, and because you have managed to leave the experience behind you, you start enjoying life and looking forward to the future.
Yes, so EMDR works actually very well with children. In the video, you see the bilateral stimulation is moving the fingers from one side to the other. But with kids, you can use clapping the hands, one at a time, or tapping, like the therapist taps the child's knees. We also have buzzers that we bought. So the child holds these buzzers and they buzz, left, right, left, right, left, right. So it actually works quite well. And then they have these different protocols for different ages. And the protocol with the smallest children is actually storytelling. So the parent actually goes through the trauma story, reads with the help of the therapist, creates like a story where it explains the traumatic experience, the child experience, starts in a positive way, the trauma in the middle, and then it ends in a positive way. And while the parent is reading the story, the therapist is tapping the child, maybe using puppets, finger puppets. And it has actually worked really well with the smaller kids, preschoolers. So now I'm going to explain a little bit about things that we use extra, like family therapy. We are 3 family therapists at Barnahus. We might be sometimes 2 therapists working with one family, In some cases, you know, the person that abused the child is a family member, and so it's, for example, a young offender. So then we will have some family therapy sessions with that might be a bit. It's more than like a normal interview with the parents, you know, because there's maybe a lot of emotions that come up. So it's good to be two therapists. Also, when there's a lot of conflict between family members, this could also interrupt the child's recovery. Sometimes we have kids that have a very bad relationship with their parents, so we need to address those matters before we can continue in therapy. Also, there's maybe parents that are not very supportive, so then that maybe this is a way also to involve them in treatment. We also have group therapy for adolescents who have finished treatment. We're two therapists, usually just a few sessions, 6 to 8 sessions, same sex, similar age, and they meet and they all have different, similar experiences, but maybe not the same, but they all gone through, for example, sexual abuse. And then we are focusing on building self-esteem, self-regulatory skills, and then also talk about self-respect and how to take care of yourself. Now I'm going to go through the trauma-focused CBT, which is the therapy that therapists here use the most. It is an evidence-based treatment, addresses a wide range of traumas, for example, physically, children who have experienced physical abuse, violence at home, or sexual abuse. It's developed for kids from 3 to 18, and it has a protocol as well, and it has a workbook for children. You can actually download this workbook online, and the website I gave you before, you know, you can go through that website for an online course. It's time limited, 12 to 20 sessions. Some kids might need more, and then parents are an important part of treatment. They're always involved. The components of trauma-focused CBT are assessment, psychoeducation, relaxation, well, these ones that you see here. The best way to remember them is by this acronym, practice. So the components are psychoeducation and parenting skills, relaxation techniques, affective expression and regulation, cognitive coping, trauma narrative and processing, in vivo exposure, conjoined parent-children sessions, and enhancing the personal safety and future growth of the child. The therapist's role is to keep the structure, to set the agenda, to make sure that you're not spending the whole time talking about the chaos, the crisis of the week. Teenagers can be very dramatic. They always have problems with their friends, and so then we have to keep the focus on the agenda. It's very directive. The therapist has a very active role and a supporting role, and it could be very fun. I bring a lot of elements of art therapy and mindfulness into it, so it's quite it has a lot of components, fun components. The first part of treatment after assessment is psychoeducation. So we talk about symptoms of PTSD or depression, anxiety. We talk about abuse, what is abuse, sexual abuse or physical abuse. We talk about how kids react after they have experienced difficult events, and then we normalize their emotions and behavioral reactions. We educate their parents about the benefits of the treatment, as well as we educate them as well as about the symptoms of the child, so that they understand better the child and why the child is reacting the way he or she is doing. Sometimes this part is overlooked because